Hello everybody, welcome back to developing a dynamic website from start to finish. This lesson is going to be talking about understanding the CMS that we're going to build in general. We're just going to go through some of the basics, overview of what we've already done really quick, and where we're going to go from there, as well as some database basics, which is kind of a hint of where we're going to be going. So far, what we've worked in is server-side technology, as well as the HTML and CSS, which we should already be familiar with. All we're still working with right now is server-side technology. Currently, we're only working in PHP. So we're going to discuss kind of what we've already done in PHP, and then move in to talk about MySQL. Which is the database. Then further down the road, we'll get into the client-side stuff. So as of right now, here's a kind of snippet of some of the coding we did in the last lesson. So what we've done here is that one document, index.php, is going to handle every page on our website so far. And you can either consider these as pages or even views. It's kind of up to you, because you really, in the traditional sense, you're not changing pages. The traditional sense, most people would think of a page as index.php, then aboutus.php, then contactus.php, things like that. We only have one page, so to speak, and we are loading different content on that page, almost giving the illusion that we're actually looking at different pages, but we are really just loading one document, or one parent document, the index.php, and then including or inserting content from other documents. So what we're doing here is, when we in the URL, we pass a variable which we've labeled page, and give it a value, in this case gallery. And what the code's going to do is it's going to check to see if there is a value to page, and if there isn't, then it should send you to the home page by default. And just to be clear, the only reason why there wouldn't be a value is if somebody just went to dynamic.series.s.2d.org. I still don't know how to say that right. But if you just went there, there's no, you're just going to the domain name, and the user's not going to know to type in page equals home or anything like that. So we don't want them to have to do that or anything. We want to automatically know that. We want to be intelligent that should go to the home page. So that's what we're doing here on line 7, or well, anyway, between line 5 and 9, is saying if page is equal to an empty string, which would mean nothing, then we create a variable that we've called PG, short for page, equals home. Else, meaning any other circumstance, basically if the page has been, or if page has been assigned a value, then store that value within the PG variable. So before moving on to the next slide, I want to reiterate what the $_get really is, and that is an array. And if you haven't watched our intro to PHP, you really should, so you understand what an array is. An array, in layman's terms, or just the long and short of it, is that an array is pretty much a variable that can hold multiple values. It's almost like a little mini database. So get can have several, quote, sub-variables assigned to it. In this instance, page being the sub-variable. It's not necessarily the correct term, but for this example, that's what we'll call it. It's really considered a key. Page would be the key, and page has a value, so there is a key and a value in every array. And you can have multiple keys, and each one of those keys has a value. That's where you see URLs where several things are being defined. You might say page equals gallery, and then the ampersand or and sign type equals 7. Things like that. I don't know. You'll see several things being defined up there. Right now we're defining one thing, but each one of those things, each one of those, the page, and in my example, type would be another key for the get array. And lastly, just as a refresher, get is something built into PHP and pretty much a common term throughout web in the browser environment. To retrieve any value from the URL, you would be getting it. So keep that in mind. Once we've determined what PG is going to be, then PHP loads a file from the server based on what we've sent to the URL. So there is going to be, in this case, a gallery.php will be loaded because we've given the variable PG the value of gallery up there, as you can see in the top from the last slide. So that's going to look on the server and look in the content folder and grab that file, which you see here. If you remember correctly, we had a folder labeled content, and then we have a document in here for each of the pages or views or whatever we want to call them. Pretty much any of the instances that could be called with page equals. And then down at the bottom right is just an example of what was in gallery.php. It was some generic HTML. So these PHP documents are not full HTML documents. They don't have the body and the head, the HTML, all those tags. We're just inserting more HTML or PHP or whatever. We're just inserting more code within the parent document, which is index.php. Index.php holds all the core, we'll say core tags, being HTML, head, body, etc. So at this point, we need to determine what we're going to do now, because the way we're doing it is a way that is totally plausible. You have technically built a CMS. However, you haven't really built a CMS that a client can manage. You've built a CMS that someone with web knowledge can manage. Somebody still has to, at this point, modify those content documents in order to change the data that would be displayed. And though we could continue that way, there's ways to do this. What's more common would be utilizing a database hosted on the server to store this information instead. And I'm just going to run through a really quick example of how to do so. I'm not going to get very detailed with it, but just give you the basic idea of what we're going to do. It's going to be, you're going to see some similarities from what we've already done, but then you're going to see where it kind of takes a turn. So we're still going to get the value from the URL. So page equals gallery. We're going to take that information to the server, run a query, which is there in the blue, within the blue box there. It's an example of a query. And in that example, we are basically saying select all records from the pages table where page equals whatever the value of PG is. And that's going to return as a result. What that result is, what that record is, that is all depends on how we set up our database and our table. In this case, we would most likely have our table set up to have. So once that query has been run, the data is then sent back to our browser, to our computer, and will display the information that we wanted. So it's not as much of a loop as I'm making it look like here. This is more just to illustrate that these are all things happening on the server. This is you in the beginning, and then this is you getting your result. So whereas a lot of this may or may not seem confusing, we'll start getting into explaining what all this means. And at this point, it might seem like we're adding a bunch of extra work. What's wrong with just having those pages those documents that we created, and loading those up? And the real answer is that when it comes to allowing the client or whoever to modify the content of the website, which is the core concept of a content management system, we want to make that experience as slick, as streamlined as possible, and utilizing a database is the best way to do so. So really quick, just some basic database terms just to get you familiar. I'll also note that along with our Intro to PHP series, you could also check out our Intro to Online Databases, which runs through the basics much more than we're going to do here. But this would just be either a refresher or at least give those who haven't seen that series or don't know much about databases in general just the real core concepts here. So we have tables, fields, which are also called columns. I'll generally refer to them as fields in most circumstances. Records, commonly referred to as rows. You might find me mismatch these, not mismatch, but go back and forth from these terms, but usually I consider to be a record. And then primary key, or ID is another term for it, primary ID, or just ID in general. This is a very important part of the whole process, especially when we get into what's called relational databases, which is really what we're going to be doing, but I'm not going to explain what that means yet, or get into that yet, not until a little bit later down the road. So we're going to talk about primary keys, or as I like to just call them, an ID, or the primary ID. What an ID really is a way to identify a specific record in a database table. So if you think about it, what are some possible IDs? How could you locate a record in a database? Let's take an example, just a database. Let's say a contact list on your phone is a real easy example of a database. If you have a smartphone, or you understand the concept of a contacts, or you understand the concept of that anyways, of having a phone that has a list of your contacts in it. That is a database, and that's where all the information for your contacts are stored. So to retrieve that information, we could do it with the first name, or maybe the last name. Street address could be an ID. Phone number could be an ID. Maybe city or state. And these are just examples. I'm kind of making you think. And we're going to kind of eliminate these. Now, technically, all of these could be IDs, but what we're looking for is the primary ID, a unique identifier. So that's something you need to think about, and you might already be able to start narrowing that down in your head. First name is out. The odds of every single person in our contacts database having a unique name, that meaning there's no two Allens spelled the same way, no two Johns, no two Marys, etc. You might think last name, because last names are a little more unique and not as common, but you still have Smith and Miller and things like that. I mean, you're going to have more than one. It's just, the odds are. So then street address, you might think, well, there's only one house or address for where I live, where anybody lives, or where anything sits. That could be unique. However, there could be more than one person living at that address, so that screws us up as well. Now, I'm just going to eliminate city or state already, because that's obvious. There's going to be tons of people living in the same city or state as you, especially if if this is your contacts database. So phone number would be the most plausible ID. The odds of somebody having a unique phone number or having the same phone number is a lot more slim, now that I think about it. Now, that may not have been the case back when landlines were more prevalent, but now that people have mobile phones and everybody has, most people have their own phone, a phone number is an even better way to get a unique identifier. However, that one is still flawed too. In certain circumstances, you might be able to pull that off, but really, to be honest, out of contact information and things like that, generally email address is the most used, or at least second most used identifier, because no two email addresses should be the same. You may have 20 different email addresses for yourself, but generally people don't share the same email address, and those who do, well, they're just kind of out of luck. You'll notice that a lot of places you register for or sign up for look for your email address to be your main ID or your username, and that just basically means that if John and Sally Smith at hotmail.com, which I just made up, by the way, don't email them, I don't know if that's real or not, that may be a joint account between John and Sally. However, they're only going to be able to create one, say, Facebook account off of that email address. So either John or Sally, if they want their own individual Facebook account, is going to have to create another email address that's unique. So email address could be a way to do it. But the most common outside of that is an automatic generated number or string. You'll find once we start making databases that you can pretty easily set it up to automatically give each record an ID number, and it will just pretty much automatically insert that. If I put a new record into the database and we have it set up correctly, it will give that ID, it'll give it a primary key of 1, and then the next one will automatically be 2 and 3 and 4 and so on, and it continues on like that, and it will never give the same number to anybody. Now, a lot of people end up using strings, which would be a combination of numbers and alphabetical characters and things like that. Alphanumeric string. That's used as well. That gives even more possibilities to the amount of IDs you can have, the number of IDs, because at some point that number itself, 1, 2, 3, 4, as it goes up and up and up, could get so big. In order to shrink the ID number down as far as length of characters, you could start using alphabetical characters and or just special characters like dashes and pluses and things like that. Either way, all tables must have a primary key ID, however you want to word it, because we have to have a way to pull out a specific record. Now you can try and use things like first name, last name, things like that if you want. You can set it up that way. But if you want it to work properly, you're going to run into many issues. So let's talk about what a database table is anyway. A database table, at its core, stores records, rows, which have been given values to each predefined field or column. And I say predefined because when we create a table, we will also create the fields or the columns. And if you want to think about it in terms of like a spreadsheet, which is where I think the column term comes from, you would have something like a first name column, last name column, street address, etc., etc., and then you fill in the rows, or you fill in the data within those rows, and each one of those rows becomes what we call a record. And using a spreadsheet like made in Excel or Google Documents or however you did so, those can actually be pretty quickly converted into databases if done correctly. This is an example of what a database could look like, and using that kind of view of a spreadsheet, kind of that idea, and that's usually how we look at it when we run a query. This is kind of how the results come. No matter what tool we use to run the queries, it's going to come back in a similar fashion. It may not be as pretty, but it will come back in a table fashion, which is where that term table probably comes from. So you can see I've got the ID 012. So my record, Alan, my ID number is 0. So you could select all from whatever this table's name is, where ID equals 0, and that would retrieve all the fields or the value for those fields associated with record number ID. Basically, you get all that information, Alan, Quant, Indiana, 32, and then we can do something with that. What we're going to be doing after this will be kind of fine-tuning the documents we've already created, taking a look at what we've done as far as the code itself, a little less slide heavy and getting back into the code. But I did want to run this by you. I want to make sure everybody's still on the same page and that we're understanding things, and remind people to check out the Intro to PHP and Intro to Online Databases. Both those series are on our YouTube channel, and you should be able to follow along with those pretty nicely. So we look forward to seeing you guys back here at lesson 8. So thanks for watching.